Hey everyone, welcome back to the Miss Education Podcast. My name is Victoria, the host, and this is the podcast where we talk all things education, meaning schools, school systems, teaching, communities, and a place where we get to dissect challenges, futuristic ideas, and other social justice matters. Today we are going to talk about international education. We are with Safa Babikir. She's a third culture kid, poster child from Sudan, grew up in Qatar and the US. She has a background in foreign service, worked in international education as an educator, researcher, and a writer who's my friend, thought partner, and colleague from graduate school. So let's welcome Safa. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Vic. This is so wonderful. We've had a lot of conversations, a lot of late nights talking about the state of education. And I'm so honored to be a guest on your show and to support the vision. And I'm excited to talk about international education with you.
Thank you. So just off the top, international education, it sounds so glamorous, right? And it sounds so, we're in this world of globalization. The countries all over the world are more connected now than ever before. And I think people value having an international and intercultural education in their schools with even parent to child, teaching them about the world is really important. But is international education truly international, or is it kind of Western education morphed into this box called international education? What do you think about that?
Oh, that is a very layered topic. So, I mean, as a product of someone of international education, and I'm going to define international education as just education that is foreign to the local context. So if you're in an Arabic speaking country, for example, and you have an English curriculum, British curriculum, a Swiss curriculum, an American curriculum, that's considered international education to the local context, right? The primary language of instruction is foreign. And so it creates an interesting dynamic in terms of like what kind of learners and teachers and global citizens you're creating. I think it is very Western. I think it is a natural byproduct of the history of colonialism. You have a hegemony set in place of what is like accredited, even that term, accredited institutions in the space of international education, who gets that accreditation, and also by the K through 12 experience or the higher ed experience, are you truly welcomed into that space, right? So sure, you have your IGs, your A levels, your IB, your APs, all these abbreviations.
Yeah.
But what is like the ultimate objective? Are you really getting a seat at that table? And that's what I think is like the biggest contradiction of international education. And there's just so much to go into this. So I'm going to stop.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop right here, and we can build on it.
Okay. And in your schooling, you did those accreditations, right? You did the IB, right? You did the A levels. Like you've done all that. How was that experience for you from K to 12?
Wow, it was. I've done every form of accredited system in the international school ecosystem. I think my experience, to be honest, it was a very isolating bubble because, again, like it is foreign to the context. So you enter these campuses that are usually huge and they're built to be isolated, right? Because you're creating a bubble of international, which is really just either British or American or Swiss. You're creating a bubble of this campus. Like there's a physical aspect of it that is very isolating to the local community. Right. And I think there's an interesting dynamic where you find a lot of, let's say, expats in that community. If you're in the context of like Qatar, for example, most expats send their kids to international schools because it is like the gold standard. Again, they want, as an expat, you're trying to access opportunity, and you're told the best way to do that. That's the narrative, is to go into these international institutions so that you could send your kids anywhere in the West primarily to pursue higher education. And so my experience, I learned a lot of great skills from the West, right? But by the time I came to graduate, I was like, I know nothing about my local context.
Mm.
Slowly, there is like, without getting too like pessimistic, but when I reflect, like there was an erasure of my context, of my language. Um, you lose a lot of your identity because you're focused on surviving and succeeding in the Western context or whatever context you're delivered in that accredited institution. And it becomes very challenging to assimilate back into your local context and succeed and thrive there. Because again, you from kindergarten, you were kind of isolated into this bubble. And once you graduate, and let's say you don't have, there are so many barriers to actually studying abroad. We could talk about visas, we could talk about financial status. So I have this like high school degree that is accepted and approved, and I've taken my SATs and I can go to the States or Canada or the UK, but like the economic, social, political barriers to that kind of, not everybody gets that opportunity and not everybody can survive in the West. And so you turn back to your local community, but you're so far gone and so far removed from, due to that like socialization and institutionalization, that it becomes a struggle for you to succeed or thrive in that context or to become accepted into that context. And so again, like, what is the point of an education, right? You're gearing up a certain type of learner, a certain type of global citizen, and even that term, global for who?
Mm-hmm.
But are you like contributing to your local context? Are you, building bridges from your local context? It felt a lot of the times that I needed to succeed abroad before being able to, and then come back and establish my own foreign entity, without ever like working with the system locally.
Yeah.
They seem to be parallel, never touching.
Right.
So yeah, that was
Yeah.
my.
Thank you. There were so many things I wanted to touch on.
Mm-hmm.
One aspect, you said that it's very isolating from the where you are, where what culture you're in. And I had a question about, does it feel isolating on the ground? Like, do people who don't attend international schools in a certain context, let's say in Qatar, are
Mm-hmm.
there people who are not attending international schools? Do you notice the difference in life trajectory of your Sudanese cousins and family members who don't go to IB schools? They don't have the accreditations of the British Council or whichever schools they're with. Is there a clear divide, like an economic or societal divide? And how do people feel about international education? Is it really well respected? People really want to go to those schools? Or is it seen as you're kind of selling out? You're not really focusing on our culture and it's not our education.
Oh, very, very strong hot topics. I think I'll start off when I was teaching. I taught in the public sector, so I taught in the local context,
Hmm.
and this is like where I saw firsthand the gap of how the way of knowing and the way of learning and the expectation. The contradiction here was that a lot of the curriculum was written by foreign educators, right? So even if it is being taught in Arabic, even if it is being taught in the local context, the way of knowing, the pedagogy was very Western.
Mm-hmm.
So there seems to be like a contradiction in the public school sector of like, we are going to teach in our own language. We are going to, preserve our culture and our language. But the ways of knowing and the ways of teaching are tied to the Western standard.
Right.
Because why would someone like me with an international education and an international background, a Western background, be accepted to teach in that and be responsible for 300 plus kids? My style is going to be influenced by my British teachers, my American teachers, my Western teachers, right? And so, again, like there's this interesting overlaying confused element of like, what is the standard of education, or what is the standard of local education? I think the trajectory of people, they both succeed, right? Like, but they're succeeding in their own contexts. But when you asked about how do people feel about international education, I think there's definitely this I should be in international education. It's viewed as very positive of like, oh, you speak English, you got it. You know what I mean? You went to this, higher education institution abroad. You must know better. And I think it's that, again, going back to colonialism, it's like this culture of like the West is better. And it's internalized in how people view you. There's a lot of privilege with going to international education that the community automatically assumes you're the expert. And it makes me like sad to see. Of course, this isn't the case for everybody. I'm just talking about my experience, but it when I was seeking for excellence, or like a different North Star than the West, I had to really dig and dive and like research that on my own. Like it was my own mission to see like what is a like all I hear is Bloom's taxonomy in the West. What is like the Arabic version of that, right? And I don't have you can't find that easily. Like you really need to like do your own research. So success wise, they're successful in their local community, in their regional community. And I think, but still, if your coworker has like or your coworker, or your colleague, or your peer at grad school or undergrad speaks English or had like a little time in a foreign school, you're seen as like, oh, okay, you got it. And it's not just English. It's like if you went to the French school, if you went to the German school, like very Western country, like culture. I don't see it being like that same energy isn't brought if you, I don't know, did like the Sudanese system, which is again foreign to the Qatari system. If we're like, that's also international education, right? If we had an Indian school in Qatar, that's international education. But when we say the term international education, what do we automatically assume? We assume GCSE, we assume AP, we assume IB. So yeah, I hope that answers a little bit.
Yeah. No, it does. It does. And it seems like the standard is not clear, right? Like it's not clear what is the local education, maybe because at this point, depending on the context, maybe some communities are so disenfranchised, they don't even know what is their local education. They've not invested in it. Maybe they're investing more in international education and they're looking for the outside sources. They're looking for the American university scholars to give them the best curriculum instead of actually focusing on their own knowledge and their own wisdom. It's possible. I mean, I taught in Vietnam, right?
Yeah,
So I was thinking about that context, and I know that a lot of people there, they see the social mobility through international education. That's
exactly.
at least how they would see it. And I think there's not many paths to quote unquote success, right? Like success in the eyes of money or wealth. There isn't a lot of success to be had if you are going to go to the local public school, you don't speak English, and then you don't go abroad or to any university, right? Like you're going to be basically in the same socioeconomic status for your whole life, right? And I don't know, that's kind of what I find sad sometimes about international education, because if the only way forward is to kind of reject your own culture and context, and like, is that really success for everyone? I'm not really sure what that looks like. Whereas some places, they are really detached from international education in ways that I kind of
Yeah,
appreciate.
yeah, yeah,
I remember
absolutely.
when I was in Nicaragua, I
Mm.
was in an extremely remote village. Like it took me 3 planes and a boat to get to that place. Like
Wow.
specifically that there's no direct flight to the place that I was going to. So I flew to Bluefields and then I took a 1 hour speedboat around because there's no roads like from that place I was to the mainland. Like just yeah. And so when I was there, I would ask some students, what do you want to do? Some of them wanted to go to the main city to go to medical school. Other people were like, yeah, we'll just stay here. And I was like, oh, okay. And it's a super small community. Like, I don't actually know the population size, but I would say 3,000 maximum, like maximum. And I was like, yeah, what would you do here? Like, what would be your job? And they were like, oh, maybe I'll work at the shop that my parents work at. Maybe I will, I don't know, be a nurse at the clinic right here. Maybe I will, I don't know, run the basketball team. Like just these things that are so extremely local.
Yeah, yeah,
And they're kind of like, we don't really want to go anywhere. I'll just be here. I'm like, oh, okay. And a lot of them had that opinion where they were kind of like, we don't really want to go anywhere. Some of them thought about the States here and there, but really they were not looking to move and do these things abroad and let's go travel to Greece. Like they were kind of just wanting to stay in their own context and live their life in a very
Mhm.
simple manner, which I haven't seen a lot of when I've gone abroad. I've seen basically the opposite, right?
Mhm.
I've seen a lot of people respecting me simply because I speak English,
Yeah.
right? And in a lot of contexts where there's a lot of discrimination, this is like a bit of a
Yeah.
sidestep, but there's a lot of discrimination specifically towards Black and Brown people all over the
Mhm.
world, but especially in
Absolutely.
places where people are usually not Black and Brown, like Europe, like Asia. But if you speak English, you kind of now have like a leg up, right?
Yeah.
So it's like if I came to a specific country in Asia or in Europe and I didn't speak any English and I'm Black, they would be like, "Whoa,
Mhm.
that's enough. We don't
Yeah.
need you here. Like you're kind of ruining the vibe, the space." And if
Yep.
I come in and I'm like, "Hey, I'm from Canada," they're like, "Oh, you're from Canada. This is so
Yes.
exciting." Like now I have this huge leg up because I speak English, right? And because you perceive me a certain way.
Yeah.
And I find that sad, right? Because some people maybe they try to speak English and then they have an accent, and then when you have an accent it follows you and it stigmatizes you as well. So there's definitely parts to that that I'm really interested in about international education. But
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
And
absolutely.
yeah. And I think that the downsides, I don't know if you think at all that international education is exploitative. And when I say exploitative, I mean that people pay 20, 30, 40, $50,000 a year to
Yeah.
get international education when they're in non-Western countries.
Yeah.
And we don't pay that much for my public system. Even private schools in the West don't pay that much per year. I mean, depending, right? There's
Yeah.
definitely scales, but people are paying that money USD and they don't make USD, right? And their whole family is pooling money for them to go to the international school so that they can hopefully get somewhere in life. And
Yeah.
I find that system a bit exploitative in the sense that there's no guarantees for support. A lot of the schools have questionable administration. A lot of the schools are they're not focusing on the best pedagogical practices. They're not focusing on, making sure that students are also having culturally relevant, responsive to their specific context. And they're kind of just, I don't know, maybe it's a money grab. I don't know. What do you think
Oh,
about that?
I have, a few thoughts on this. I think, historically speaking, international schools, let's say I'll take the example of Sudan. So when the British came, they opened up a British system school
Yeah,
to send their own kids there, right? So when
right,
you come in as an officer, you come in as a big shot, you bring in your whole family, right? And you have your admin people, you have a team, and you need to send your family and your kids to school. So you're like, okay, we're gonna open up our school,
yeah,
right? Because we are the colonizer, and we're here to, we're not here to assimilate with you guys.
right,
We're gonna separate our children from you, from the
right,
public. And we'll give a few seats to some local officers who are wealthy enough or loyal enough or contribute enough to our mission so their kids can, maybe we'll give two seats for their kids to join our school. And immediately, like, this is like a power dynamic.
yeah,
So the root of international education wasn't really for, let's say, local communities to experience Western culture. It was really for those who came in with that mindset of not assimilating. We're not going to enter the public school system here because we're not from here and we don't want to learn from here.
right,
And in the reverse expectation of that is that when, you know you immigrate to the US, you have to send your kid to the public school system, or the West, like, American school system, and you're only going to get Western options 9 times out of 10. So you have to assimilate, versus when they come in to Qatar or Vietnam or whatever, they don't have to assimilate. They have enough political power, economic power to, have their own school, import their own curriculums, and, be seen as the elite. And
right.
so I think that's like the contradiction and the hypocrisy of like international education is that it's only one way. Like you won't assimilate, but you're asking me to
Right.
assimilate, right? It's not an equal cultural exchange. And so, and you know, I don't know a single like Arabic accredited school system that is in the West, right? You don't
Right.
have like an Arabic university in the West, but you have a lot of satellite campuses in the Arab world. And I'm speaking from that because I'm like, maybe there's more, but that's like been my observation. We don't have like a Vietnamese university or school in anywhere outside of Vietnam.
Yeah.
It becomes very difficult to think of it as anything other than just like not a cultural exchange, not, you know, creating mutual gaps of understanding. Some schools might have some, you know, local activities and, well, we're going to have one history lesson on the country we're in, but it's a superficial level. It's not true engagement with um, the local culture or the local region. And I think it's a huge missed opportunity. You know, I have nothing against curriculums. Everybody's trying to learn one way or the other, but I do feel like this underlying rejection of the local culture, rejection of like the local community, and this concept of um, well, only like we're here, but we're here with our own fences and our own borders, and you conditionally can enter this space, and it's a conditional seat. And if you graduate, I don't care if you have top marks or whatever, you're still an outsider, you know?
Yeah.
It doesn't leave the best impression. And not to say there are bad people in these schools, but again, it's part of the larger system and like the repercussions of it and the social influence it has and the political and economic, like it's so deep and complex that when you're in it, you don't really realize it. Just like, hey, you know, I could write a really good essay right now, you know, or like I could do this grade level of maths or science, but you know, as a kid, you don't really realize it. But when you leave, you're just like, wait a minute, who actually invented science? Like, was it really who and history again? Like when we talk about the history of like, um, you know, whether it's the U.S. context or British colonialism or the Ottoman Empire, it's given to you from the POV of the institution you're in.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like, what does that do for the ways of knowing for, you know, these people that leave these systems?
Yeah.
And it's not a small number. Like, there are so many international schools in Qatar and in Sudan, in Egypt. Like, in the Arab world, there are so many international schools. There's also a lot of local schools, but it always seems like the international schools are the ones people are proud to go to.
Right. Right.
And that doesn't sit right with me. Like I want there to be an equal cultural of exchange, like equal like ways of knowing and knowledge of the other. But you know,
Yeah.
where it's almost like divide and conquer, but in like through international education. And that might be harsh to some people listening to that. That is like the reality. And I just want to add as well, like even in the US,
Mm-hmm.
the way history is taught is also a form of like I'm giving an example of the subject of history,
Yeah.
but also shows no international education, like no form of global citizenship. And so the Western like persona of like we're building global citizens, but when I speak to someone who's purely never left their town or city in the West, I seem to know more.
Right.
And that's not to, and I'm saying that not to say like, oh, I had a better education. No, but it's, you're part of like a victim too,
Yeah.
where you're not getting a global education.
Yeah.
I'm also not getting like that much of a global education, but you too, like you also need to hold your institutions accountable.
Right.
Because they're telling us over here, you need to have 21st century skills and you need to build global citizens and agency and all of that. But wait a minute, like my counterpart isn't being held accountable to that
Yeah.
same standard. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Especially when the counterpart is one of the big systems that keeps infiltrating in other countries and says,
Yeah.
here's the system you should learn by. Here's my $50,000 per year American international school. But like the kids in the States are not learning about that country, or they don't really have an investment in the places that you're trying to go in. Right. So
Yeah.
that's confusing, right? It's like, it's not,
Yeah.
it doesn't really make sense. I wonder
And
if it's possible to have that mutual, like truly
mm,
mutual exchange. I don't know. If, for example, like you said in Qatar, is it possible to have people come in from the West, they come to live, their parents have a job, but they're kind of put in this place where, hey, you're in Qatar. You're going to learn some history here. You're going to do something that's totally different than where you came from. Let's say you came from the UK,
mm,
right? Is it possible to have that true exchange? And are people talking about that? Are they think, is it starting, or is this kind of an idea that you've had and you haven't
mm.
really heard it happen in the countries that you're from?
I think it happens to on a superficial level, right?
Okay.
Like they will have cultural exchange days. You'll have like national days. The school will be asked to like create a poster about like the history of Qatar, but are we really engaging with Qatari culture?
Yeah.
Um, and so, and again, like I'm not saying there should be, for example, like um, only, let's say, we only learn about Qatar. We should be learning about, you know, the diversity within the school itself. But
Yeah.
because we are in this context, it's a shame. Like when people graduate, most people don't even speak Arabic.
Right.
And I can't imagine immigrating to the US and not knowing English, or
Yeah.
like working in the US and not knowing English. Like you have to. It's the same thing in Sudan. Like international kids who go to Sudan and who study in international systems, they could go through K through 12 without picking up Arabic. Like they'll be fine.
Right.
And that's very interesting to me, like how, and it goes back to that isolating bubble. Like you really do operate in this bubble.
Yeah.
And I think it's a larger issue of just like, we going back to like the finances of it. Um, your parents come in with a really good contract, a really good job. You aren't paying $50,000. Your parents' company is paying that money for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Versus like the local kid whose parents are getting paid in the local currency,
Yeah.
they're paying the 50K.
Yeah.
So it's interesting like that.
There's a power dynamic there.
Very much so. Very much so.
Yeah. And I guess I don't know if people are truly working on it then. Right? Like the international days write off, right? Like it's a one off. It doesn't really make any meaningful or sustainable change, but
Mm,
it kind of brings it back to, is it exploitative to me? And it's not that I don't want to continue learning more about international education
mm,
and investing in international education, but to me there's something about it that needs to be critiqued, and that the
yeah.
people who are in it should also have the language and tools to critique it as well, right? So even if I'm teaching in the international school system, I'm like, question me. I don't know
Yeah.
everything. I
Yeah.
came here on my own agenda to travel. Also, I think I'm a good teacher, so I'm here, and I'm getting paid in US currency,
Yeah.
making 10 times more than the average person in this country. Like, what does that mean? Right? And
Yeah.
there's so many problematic aspects to that, pay structure and everything as well. But I I don't want to get pessimistic about it. I want to ask, how do you see international education changing in the future? Or
Mm.
have you even seen over the span of, K, as in kindergarten to now, have you seen it change in a way that's made you think, wow, things are changing, there's positive movements, motions forward? And do you see any innovations or change coming up in the future?
So, um, I've saw stuff in the past that worked, but for some reason there's been a gap where it was stopped, and I
Yeah.
would like it to come back.
Yeah.
So, for example, I remember my parents telling me that the government in Sudan used to send students to, let's say, like all around the world, fully paid to get an international education, right? So you're going abroad, we're going to send you, come back. You have to come back and work for the ministry that sponsored you.
Okay.
Um, and contribute what you've learned to our local environment. So let's like reclaim that power,
Yeah.
right? Thank you for going and spending all that time. We got you covered. And when you come back, we want to unlock that potential and see how that could benefit our society. There are still countries who do this. I know Qatar does this. Um, so, but it's not every country like who's doing this that accepts international, like has international institutions. And there have been a lot of budget cuts in education overall, globally, I want to say.
Yeah.
So I would like more investment in that kind of mentality of saying like, okay, we have international schools locally, but if you want to go pursue it other places, we want you to come back and, you're tied to this like concept of like coming back and contributing what you learned. That shows like, I think, a great mutual exchange
Yeah.
element of it. I
Yeah.
think the future for international education is very interesting as well because you have like social media now to a whole other level. And I think you can't talk about that future without talking about like the technology that's in now, where it's not just spaces of like formal institutions, but it's like kids who meet on Roblox, for example, gaming. They're having a form of informal international education.
Right.
And I think the direction I would like is one that like really prioritizes like a sense of belonging, holds people accountable to their own ways of knowing, and enters spaces with curiosity. The standard is not end all be all. Like sure, you need to get, if you want to work in this company or you want to go to this university, you need to score this on the TOEFL or IELTS. But also, if you want to work in Qatar, you should score this on like the Arabic equivalent of.
Right.
There needs to be that mutual like respect of holding standards. And I hope that, this conversation that we're having is like one I've not talked to actually a lot of people about, because I think it's also exoticized, right? Like, oh, you're from an international education. What's that like, right? They're not taking you, they're not really seeing all of the layers and the complexity and the power dynamics. And there's just like a huge ignorance of the space, right? It's seen as like a glamorous way to travel around the world from a teacher's point of view.
Right.
And from like a student point of view, it's like, oh, you lived abroad.
Yeah.
But what did that like mean for the local community? What did that mean for like my identity? So we'll see. We'll see. I don't have like a solution. We'll see.
Yeah.
But I think these conversations are important, right?
Yeah. Honestly, the way that my mind works, which might just be because I'm so Gemini and like kind of chaotic, when we start talking like this, I'm like, we could do this. So what do we start? What's the nonprofit? What's the thing going to be? Maybe we should work at the ministry in Qatar, and then we can talk. And then what about if we my brain is going crazy.
Yeah.
This is possible. If only people put their minds to things that actually made sense and were actually for people, like in service of people, and not just for the bottom line, right? For their own capital. But I am thinking about so many different I have so many projects right now.
But I love that about you. The ideation, let's get it. Let's go.
But I think that this is something that could be further explored. And, we both did consulting with international ministries, right? In graduate school, we did that. And it's like, we didn't have these conversations necessarily, right? Even though they were coming to me in good faith, asking about COVID responses and education. And I'm giving you maybe responses that are more Western. Maybe I'm giving you responses that are from a different context than yours. What about you? Like, you know the most. How about you give me your sounding board and I give you advice on what you say, versus you saying, do you have any articles? Do you have any strategies that you know from your context? And we can share, obviously, interculturally, we can share, but sometimes there's a huge reliance on us because it seems like we know the most. But people actually know a lot for their own specific societies, for their own specific culture. And they need to kind of cherish that more a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember we also like the buzzword that was going around in our time was like culturally responsive, like pedagogies, right?
Yes.
And in that UNESCO like Futures of Education document, they really tried to like, oh, cultural, like that was a big thing. But what's tied to like UNESCO funding, for example, is being like the standard of Western standard.
Yeah.
So if you have like, let's say, local curriculum and you say, okay, ours is oral, traditional, like
Yeah.
communication. This is how we don't have our students take exams. They don't sit in like the traditional classroom. How are you going to get funding from like international global institutions? Because they don't recognize that as the
Yeah.
standard. You need to pass all, you have a little inspector. And I've experienced this. I've seen this, like where inspectors come from Canada, they come from the US, they come from the UK, and they come into like public local schools. And
Yeah.
everybody's running around trying to look for folders and like we're legit, right?
Yeah.
Bending backwards to their standards, because if they saw like they would like almost hide their own ways of doing things, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, like it's complicated. So I really, when you say like what is your way of knowing, how do you give that voice of authenticity? Because again, like as someone who's seen as like you're from the West, they might not trust you, right? They might look at you like, what is like, what are you actually trying to ask for here? And how can I be authentic and genuine when your standard or your like the door to your society is so rigid from my point of view? So I need to like bend over and change things and adapt so that I could put my foot in the door in your culture in your society. So yeah, I think, but again, like I don't think of this as a pessimistic view. I think of this like we need to like address the reality
Yeah.
and hold these terms accountable and hold like the ties of why it's not happening. Why don't we see a lot of like authentic curriculums that are culturally responsive to the context? And it's really the teacher's burden to do that, right? So like if the teacher is like creative enough, she'll figure out a lesson plan that touches on those things. But it's system wise, like she or he are just fighting that system.
Yeah.
So it's exhausting on them to kind of bring into the conversation constantly. And so, yeah, just I think more conversations around this and holding these buzzwords accountable and really
Yeah.
like dissecting what is that. Let's talk about that. What does that mean? How far are you willing to be flexible? And so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's a great action step forward, actually holding those buzzwords accountable, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you are, let's say I'm training new teachers and they're talking about culturally responsive pedagogy. Amazing. In theory, absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And I can say, what does that mean to you? I know you just read it in the textbook, but what does that actually mean to you? Okay, so let's say you have students coming in. Let's say they're from Sudan. How will you incorporate their culture into the curriculum beyond saying, okay, everyone's going to read an article? You can read an article written by a Sudanese person.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Okay. That's their perspective. And you could dive even deeper. What are
Yeah.
some practices from Sudan that are
Yeah.
actually, completely different than our way of learning and thinking? Maybe there's a way that they sit on the ground in kindergarten that's different than
Yeah.
us. Maybe there's a way that they speak, like there's certain words in Arabic that are different that have different meanings. Let's bring that
Yeah.
into the classroom for a second and say, okay, in English we have these few words, and actually in Arabic they have these few words. Let's compare. Let's talk about the meanings, right?
Yeah.
What are people actually saying when they speak? Because language is so different and it's so personal and also so
Absolutely.
deeply cultural. So just kind of challenging our teachers about what do you mean when you say culturally responsive pedagogy? Are you actually going into that culture? Are you respecting that culture? Or are you just saying, okay, yeah, you can look at that article and then let me know about what you read, and then we all move on.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
and that's a great
And
action point.
I'm thinking back to like your point on black and brown,
Yeah,
that experience. I think also, sadly, without getting too controversial, but there are a lot of racist teachers that come into these spaces,
yeah,
not willing to engage with the local culture when you have the population of the students
yeah,
largely are like diverse international students.
yeah,
And so we need more conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also calling, educators out when, hey, like what you just said, it was very inappropriate, but you have such positional authority and power that as a 12-year-old, I can't challenge,
hmm,
who do I go to?
yeah,
Um, and so having this, I think culturally responsive pedagogy, global international education, and diversity, equity, and inclusion go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
You have to vet your educators really well. You
Mm-hmm.
have to have curious, open-minded educators and to develop curious, open-minded, tolerant learners.
Yeah.
And, sadly, like I've seen way too many dark things or
Yeah.
experiences, and nobody can hold you can't hold them accountable.
No.
Um,
Yeah, it's up to
so
us.
it's up to us, yeah.
Because like you said, the 12-year-old can't necessarily always advocate for themselves. And so we have to be the ones to advocate. And I don't even think it's that controversial. There are racist teachers, and they are everywhere around the world. I've taught with them. You've taught with them. We've been taught by them.
Yeah.
They're everywhere, right? And it's like, let's stop it in its tracks. I don't want
Yeah.
to meet the next person who's, I'm going to become a teacher, and you just said something racist yesterday. Goodbye.
Mm-mm.
No, because I've
Yeah.
seen it before, and I've seen examples of people saying outright racist things, and then they want to carry on about their education career. And I'm like, listen, you need
No.
to take a pause.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not talking about this full throttle, you're canceled, you can never teach again. I'm talking, let's take a pause, let's reflect. Have you taken accountability? Do you
Mm-hmm.
know that what you did was wrong and for what reasons? And how are you going to make it better for the future? We barely go through that process. We're like, one person gets mad, we see the crocodile tears, we're like, fine, we'll just forget about it. And then we go back to normal. And it's just a waste of everyone's time because who's hurting in the end is the students.
Exactly. It's heavy.
No, it is. It is.
Mm.
But let's end on a bright note. So
Yeah.
thank you. No, thank you so much. This conversation was so great. You're a wealth of a breadth of knowledge.
Stop,
Always.
Victoria.
All the wisdom. I feel like we were gonna be co-hosts, but I was actually just like, wait, Safa, say everything. Just tell me anything in your
Oh,
brain, get it out.
no, I
We're
appreciate
like
you
an
so
interview.
much.
We're like an interview. That was crazy.
Oh, I appreciate you so much, Victoria. You always like create spaces where people can talk openly. And I
Thank
think
you.
that's a gift, right? And that is something like I deeply admire. Whether it's like you hosting like get-togethers at your spot or calling somebody up and like, let's talk about this. This has been on my mind. What do you think? And
Yeah.
so you're an embodiment of curiosity
Thank you.
that we need plenty of in this world. So I really appreciate that. And again, like whatever you put your stamp on, I'm following. So
Thank you. Thank you. And what
yeah.
would you say as a final note? What would you say is your vision
Hmm.
for education in the future? What can you leave us with?
I think my vision for education is like liberation. That's the future for me, is liberation.
Yeah.
Liberation of oppression, liberation of alienation, liberation of isolation, liberation of ignorance.
Yeah.
And I hopeful like with all of the technology tools and advancement and the recording of history, the more platforms people have to conversate and have dialogue, we move closer to that liberation and hold people accountable, hold institutions accountable, and learn from our history.
Absolutely.
So a future where we're not repeating our historical mistakes in education. So
That's beautiful. Thank you so
yeah,
much. We'll leave it right there. Thank you so much,
thank you so much.
Safa. And thank you everyone for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast. It's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as on YouTube. You can watch the video and audio together. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.